There's a certain kind of quiet that follows a lot of Gen X men around, and it's easy to mistake for indifference. You see it in the short answer on a phone call, the one that feels clipped even when nothing's actually wrong. You see it when he steps out of a room the second a conversation turns emotional, almost like he's got somewhere else to be. Most people chalk this up to personality, like he's just wired that way, a guy who happens to prefer peace over noise. Even the language around him tends to shrink under pressure, fewer words doing more of the work. But underneath that calm surface sits something that took years and years to form. It wasn't really a choice he sat down and made one day. It was a response to circumstance, repeated so many times that it started to look like character. For a lot of these men, being alone isn't a sign of loneliness at all. It's closer to relief, the kind you feel after holding your breath a little too long. A quiet house does something for him that other people don't quite understand. So does an empty garage on a Saturday morning, or a long drive with nobody in the passenger seat asking him questions. None of that reads to him as absence. It reads as recovery, a way of resetting after being around people for too long. Conflict tends to work in the opposite way entirely. It doesn't get approached with curiosity, and it rarely gets approached with much patience either. It gets treated like a leak that needs containing fast, something to manage quietly and then move past without much discussion. When things heat up around him, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, or some argument at the family dinner table, his instinct isn't to lean toward it, it's to step back, to get some air, to let it cool down on its own. Partners and kids often read that stepping back as coldness, as a kind of checking out, but it's closer to a reflex, something the nervous system learned to do long before anyone gave it the label of personality. The behavior itself isn't hard to spot once you know what you're looking at. There's the emotional restraint that shows up in almost every interaction. There's the reluctance to sit down and talk feelings through in any real detail, even with people he trusts. There's a strong pull toward fixing a problem quietly instead of hashing it out loud with someone else. There's the discomfort with asking for help, even in situations where help would obviously make his life easier. And there's the tendency to disappear, whether that means physically leaving the house or just going quiet at the table right when tension starts to climb. These things almost never show up in isolation. They tend to travel together as a set, forming one consistent style of moving through the world, built around control, distance, and handling things solo. What's genuinely strange is how consistent this looks across men who otherwise have nothing in common. Different regions, different income brackets, different family setups growing up, and somehow the same defensive pattern shows up anyway.
That kind of consistency raises a real question worth sitting with. Why would so many unrelated men land on almost the exact same way of protecting themselves from the same kind of exposure? Look closer at the daily texture of it, and the pattern gets even clearer. A weekend often means time in the garage, under a car hood, or out in a shed fixing something that barely needed fixing. A long commute alone in the truck can feel better than a quiet evening at home with too much talking involved. Even vacations sometimes get built around solo activities, a fishing trip, or a solitary round of golf, rather than group gatherings full of small talk. None of this is really about the activity itself. It's about the shape of it, something that lets him be present without being exposed. The answer starts down in the nervous system, long before it ever turns into something you'd call personality. When a kid grows up with caregivers who are inconsistent emotionally, warm some days and checked out on others, the brain adjusts to that unpredictability, It lowers its expectations for comfort and leans harder on self-regulation instead, because self-regulation is the one thing it can actually count on. That's not a defect in how the kid turned out. It's the brain doing exactly what it's built to do, tuning itself to whatever emotional weather it gets handed early on. For a lot of the boys who grew into Gen X men, that weather involved parents who were physically home but somewhere else mentally. They were buried in work stress, money worries, or their own unresolved history. The kid learns, without ever putting words to it, that needs have to get managed internally because outside comfort just can't be counted on consistently. Attachment theory calls this an avoidance style, and it's not because the kid doesn't crave connection deep down, it's because connection has already proven shaky enough that leaning on himself starts to look like the safer bet. Over time, that strategy stops feeling like a strategy at all. It just quietly becomes who he is. If any of this sounds a little too familiar, it might be worth sitting with that feeling for a second instead of brushing right past it. If these ideas resonate with you, consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of psychology and human behavior. That flicker of recognition is usually right where the real thinking starts, so let's keep following it further. It rarely arrives with words attached, more like a sense of being seen without asking to be. To understand why this pattern took hold so widely in one specific generation, it helps to look closely at their surroundings. What were these men actually growing up inside of day after day? Gen X came of age during a stretch of serious, sustained family instability across the country. Divorce rates in the United States climbed fast through the 70s and into the early 80s, reaching levels higher than anything seen in generations before them. A lot of these kids picked up the label latchkey kids, walking home to empty houses after school. Both parents were working just to keep up with inflation, layoffs, and an economy that kept shifting under everyone's feet.
The kind of steady emotional supervision earlier generations might have counted on became inconsistent, and that shift came out of necessity rather than neglect. Parents were doing their honest best under conditions that left almost no room left over for emotional attunement at home. What came out of all that was a generation of kids who learned early that being self-reliant wasn't just admirable, it was basically required just to get through an ordinary week. On top of that, the broader mood of the country during those years carried its own weight. Cold War anxiety sat quietly in the background of childhood, along with nightly news coverage of crime, recession, and social unrest. Boys absorbed a general sense that the world was unpredictable and that adults couldn't always protect them from it. That backdrop didn't create the pattern by itself, it reinforced the lesson that self-sufficiency was the one thing nobody could take away from him. Culture backed up this lesson at nearly every turn during those years. Shows and movies aimed at boys during that stretch rewarded toughness and quietly punished anything that looked like visible weakness. Fathers, plenty of them raised by their own emotionally closed-off parents, modeled silence as the clearest form of strength available. Schools and youth sports leaned hard into grit over emotional honesty, treating tears or complaints as soft instead of as a kid genuinely trying to communicate something real. Even the entertainment marketed to young men across the 80s and 90s tended to glorify the quiet, capable type. He was the guy who handled things alone and never asked anybody for a hand. None of this reflected some deliberate plan to raise emotionally distant men. It simply reflected a culture that hadn't yet started talking openly about emotional intelligence as a skill actually worth building. Inside that kind of environment, shutting emotions down worked as real protection, not as some flaw to be corrected. A boy who kept his struggles private avoided adding more tension to an already shaky household. A boy who looked self-sufficient got fewer questions asked of him and fewer demands placed on him that he couldn't meet anyway. Being fiercely independent wasn't some random personality quirk in that particular context. It was a genuine survival move, one that reduced how much he had to lean on adults who were already stretched painfully thin. Distrust toward emotional openness formed along the same lines, since being vulnerable had, more than once, led to disappointment instead of comfort or reassurance. None of this points to any real failure of character on his part. These were smart, reasonable adaptations to an environment that simply didn't offer many better options at the time. The real problem was never that the adaptation happened in the first place. The problem is that it rarely switched itself back off once the original threat had long since passed. That staying power shows up decades later, often in ways these men never trace back to their own childhood at all. In relationships, the emotional distance tends to surface as trouble staying present during any real conflict. There's a tendency to shut down at the exact moment a partner most needs him to show up. In friendships, a lot of Gen X men will admit, if pushed, that they have few close male friendships built around actually talking about feelings openly. They lean instead on shared activities, golf, fixing something, watching a game, as a stand-in for real emotional closeness. At work, that same self-reliance often turns into a leadership style that looks competent from the outside but stays guarded underneath the surface. There's a real reluctance to admit uncertainty, even when asking for help would clearly get better results for everyone involved. As these men get older, isolation can creep in quietly and gradually. The very independence that once kept him safe now cuts him off from support at exactly the point in life when support starts to matter most. None of this means he doesn't want connection deep down. It means his nervous system is still running instructions it wrote decades ago in a world that looked almost nothing like the one he's actually living in now. Health tends to follow the same quiet script. Many Gen X men delay medical care longer than they probably should. They treat a doctor's visit the way they treat asking for emotional help, something to put off until it's unavoidable. Therapy, in particular, often carries an old stigma for this generation, a lingering sense that talking to a stranger about feelings is somehow an admission of failure. Retirement can hit especially hard for the same reason, since work often provided the one socially acceptable outlet for connection, built around shared tasks rather than shared feelings. Once that structure disappears, many of these men find themselves with fewer built-in reasons to stay in touch with anyone at all. Underneath all these long-term patterns sits a contradiction most of these men never look at directly, even in private. The same independence that protects him also quietly creates an ache, a wish for closeness paired with real trouble tolerating what closeness actually asks of him in practice. Therapy, in particular, restores something real in him, but it can also cover up a loneliness he'd never put a name to. Naming it would require exactly the kind of vulnerability his conditioning trained him hard to avoid. There's an assumption running underneath all of it, one suggesting that needing people is inherently risky, that getting close inevitably ends in disappointment or obligation down the road. That assumption almost never gets examined consciously, mostly because it never announces itself outright to begin with. It just quietly shapes decisions that look, on the surface, like they're about a busy schedule or a bad mood. Underneath, they're really rooted in older beliefs about safety and connection. There's also a quieter irony sitting inside all of this, one that rarely gets acknowledged out loud. Many of these men genuinely value loyalty, and they'll show up in concrete, practical ways when someone they care about actually needs them. They'll drive hours to help a friend move or fix a leaking roof without being asked twice. They'll sit quietly next to someone in a hospital waiting room for as long as it takes. What they struggle with isn't commitment or care, it's the specific act of putting feelings into words, of sitting still inside an emotional conversation without looking for the nearest exit. That gap between what he'll do for someone and what he'll say to someone is where a lot of the misunderstanding actually lives. Zoom out far enough, and this pattern stops being about one generation of men at all. It points to something deeply human, the way any living thing adapts its behavior to whatever conditions it gets handed. It keeps carrying those adaptations forward long after the world itself has already changed. People get shaped by scarcity, whether that scarcity is emotional, financial, or relational in nature, and they tend to protect themselves according to whichever kind hit them hardest growing up. Every civilization in history has leaned on people who could endure real hardship without falling apart completely. Cultures tend to reward exactly the traits Gen X men carry today: quiet endurance, controlled emotion, holding it together calmly under real pressure. What shifts from one generation to the next isn't really the underlying mechanism at work. It's just the specific conditions that end up triggering it in the first place. Every generation inherits an emotional blueprint shaped by the instability of its own particular childhood. And sooner or later, every generation has to sit down and figure out which parts of that blueprint still genuinely serve it. This isn't only an American story either, even though the specific triggers here were shaped by American conditions. Similar patterns show up in men from other countries who came of age during their own periods of upheaval, war, economic collapse, or family disruption. Wherever instability and reduced emotional supervision overlap in childhood, something like this tends to develop, dressed in whatever cultural clothing happens to be available. The nervous system doesn't really care what country it's in. It only cares whether comfort was reliable or not. A response that once kept somebody safe can stick around long after the original danger is gone. It quietly shapes the way he moves through a world that stopped asking him to survive like that a long time ago.